Hello and welcome to Arturia Microfreak Firmware 5.0. So I think the title will give you a strong hint what I'll be talking about today. Specifically, I'll be talking about the Arturia Microfreak's new 5.0 firmware. First thing to note, the upgrade of the firmware was very straightforward, but there is presently a bug, at least when I installed, in the MIDI control center, making it quite awkward to get patches on board and to upload the other media and modify it. With that being said, I managed to do it, and I loaded up all of the 5.0 presets as well as the presets from the previous versions. They've expanded the number of preset slots from 384 to 512. So I have all of the factory presets and a whole bunch of blank init patches. I actually made the first patch an init patch as well, just for simplicity's sake. So let's talk about what they've added. Well, there is one major feature and a couple of other peripheral features. One of the peripheral features is that they've restructured the utility menu, breaking it into a preset section and a global section, each with their own settings underneath. In the preset section, we have a number of adjustments that we can make here. One of the more notable ones is in the modulations. You have the capacity to adjust the legato behavior of the envelopes, but as well as the legato behavior, let's jump back to that. We have the ability to make the envelopes more snappy. So this is making them have a more exponential profile instead of the usual linear profile, which can change the timbre, especially for percussive sounds. The other noteworthy feature in the modulation section is now, previously the keyboard was available as a modulation source, but this was linear. That was to say that at some central note, this modulation was 0. As you got higher, it was positive. As you got lower, it was negative. The new random source means for every key you press, a random number is generated. You may think, well, why not just use an LFO for this, sample and hold LFO? Well, it comes down to what makes this synthesizer unique. So I'll talk a little bit about what this synthesizer is. It is actually a one-voice synthesizer, so it is a monophonic synthesizer. It has a single oscillator, albeit a complex one. It's a hybrid synth because it's digital except for the filter, which is analog. But it has a trick up its sleeve, and that trick is that the oscillator, though there is only one, 4 instances of it can occur. So you can play 4 parts paraphonically. And beyond that, the envelope is a digitally controlled analog envelope, but each of the oscillators are capable of amplitude enveloping themselves, which gives a sound which is very much like polyphony, as long as you're not moving the filter. Let me tell you what the main big hitting feature is. They've introduced the ability to use samples, so none of the previous oscillator types, of which there are many, supported samples. So now there is a mechanism for loading samples, which also proved a little problematic in the upgrade, but I believe that the MIDI control center software will be improved and this will be fixed. Rather than diving into all the features right away, I'm going to play a few presets. So this is the first of the new presets, and I'll just play a little. Interesting string sort of sound. Let's jump in a bit. Seems to be another string sound. Pretty interesting sounds there. A little further. A pad sound. Very interesting sounding and already making me wish I had more voices to play with here. The 4-part paraphony can be a little limiting, and these are very tempting and engaging sounds. A sequenced sound. Interesting tone. Another pad. Trying to play more than 4 notes again. And let's go a little further. Keys. So already I think you can hear that there are some very different sounds to what you've been able to achieve with this synthesizer thus far. So you can imagine samples have opened up a lot of opportunities here. Let's take a look at the newly added algorithms and let's discuss what they each do, and then let's design a sound at the end. So let me skip all the way through. There are now quite a lot, I believe over 20 different algorithms. The first one is called sample, and it's the simplest because it is a sample playback algorithm as opposed to a granular algorithm. I'll come back and I'll talk about what granular means when I move to one of the granular ones, but first let's listen to the samples, let's listen to the range of samples available and the parameters available for this sample oscillator. So this is the first sample, piano-like sound. The parameters of this engine are the start point, where in the sample to start playing, length, the proportion of the sample that we should play. So if I set the length short, it will only play part of it. Additionally, if you set the length to a negative value, it'll play backwards from the start point. Pretty interesting feature. And the final parameter is the loop parameter. By default, this is off, meaning it will play once and it will just stop. If you set it to a 0 or higher value, it will loop part of the sample that played. If you set it to 0, it will restart from the beginning of that sample. So if I set it to 0 instead of off, whatever length of sample I'm playing, it'll play in its entirety. And as I increase this number, it will start further through on the loop. So in this case, it'll play most of the sample and then it'll loop near the end. So you can hear that sort of bouncy sound there. I can make that loop longer. I can move it further back in the sample. So those are all the features of the algorithm itself. So it's relatively simple, but consider that you have the capacity to modulate these parameters with LFOs, with this new random source, or with anything else like the envelopes that you have available. So there's quite some interesting opportunities here, but let's listen to the range of samples so as we can explore further. To browse the samples in all of the sample-based algorithms, you hold Shift and you turn the type knob. So now we're in sample selection. Now we can just turn the type knob to select. So let's just have a look through. Piano pop, piano lo-fi, piano clean. Let's just skip fast. So I suppose you can hear as well that when the samples are repitched, it is accelerating or decelerating the playback along with the pitch. This is a fairly common thing to do. But I think there is already a pretty broad range of sounds. For your information, there are 128 slots to store these samples, and you can have about 200 seconds of sample in total. So you could say roughly each sample can be on average 1.5 seconds long if you want to use all the slots. The sample playback engine is interesting, but the rest of the engines are possibly even more interesting. Just as another FYI, in order to get out of the sample selection mode, if I turn type, it's going to select the sample. I have to hold Shift and turn the knob. So now I'm in algorithm selection. So that's the sample that I have loaded. and the rest of the algorithms are granular. So I think it's a good time to describe what granular means. Well, in the context of synthesis, granular means synthesizing using grains from a sample. Well, what is a grain? A grain is a small snippet of audio. In particular, there will be an algorithm which, given a sample, will divide it into grains. This is not usually arbitrarily in time because the grains are usually cut at zero crossings. So in other words, when the sample goes from above to below the 0 point, if you cut them at a non-zero point, you'll often hear a pop or a click at the beginning or end of the sample. So these cut points are chosen, and then grains, they can have different lengths. Potentially, when you play them back, some granular engines will allow them to be repitched, they'll allow them to be positioned in the stereo field, they'll allow them to be enveloped. And specifically, you usually don't just play these grains back to back in order. You have an algorithm by which the grain is selected, and that algorithm usually relies on what you call a playhead. So a playhead selects a point in the sample around which grains will be chosen. Exactly how they're chosen depends on the type of granular algorithm. In a lot of granular synthesizers or granular systems, you have the capacity to play back many grains simultaneously. In this, from what I've heard, you can only play one grain at a time per instance of the oscillator. So you can't get these very, very broad, super cloudy textures. But you have a number of possibilities in how these grains are selected, how they're ordered, and how one traverses through them. So let's look at the parameters of this engine. First, let's play. Sounds suspiciously like just playing the sample back, and that is because of the nature of the algorithm. So this algorithm has three parameters. The first one is scan rate. Scan rate defaults to 1.0. Remember I said there's a playhead. Well, imagine when the scan rate is 1, the granular playhead moves at the normal playback rate. So, if the grains are simply chosen from the playhead, then it will sound like the sample is just playing at its normal rate in its normal direction. The next parameter we have is density. Density is a common parameter across these synth engines, and density indicates how big or small the chosen grains are. So what happens is when you choose very, very small grains, you capture a lot of the spectral content, but you lose a lot of the inharmonic content and the longer scale movement and rhythm. When you have larger pieces that you break into, you retain a lot of that rhythm, but you lose a lot of the smoothness and wavetable-like motion that you can get. Since we're playing at this 1.0 rate, you'll find that changing density doesn't make much difference. Very low density, mid density, very high density, you can find that there are some slight artifacts when you get to very high density because, remember I said the grains get cut at zero crossings. When we're scanning through, what happens is it's scanning at a uniform rate, but some grains are slightly longer and some grains are slightly shorter. So some of the grains may be played twice, some of them may only be played once in the scan. So you can get some slight artifacts when the grains are very short and therefore repeating very rapidly. The final parameter is, I think, where the interest is. The final parameter is called chaos, and what chaos does, it instead of picking the grain that is at the playhead, it will randomly select one from an interval around the playhead, and the more the chaos parameter is turned up, the larger the allowable interval for selecting the grains from is. So when I turn chaos very high, so it sounds very cut up because it's jumping around very far from the playhead, so the timbre is changing. And hopefully you can hear the sort of grain length. It's actually fairly notable chunks of audio, and because this is a melodic piece, you can hear quite a lot of variation. As I make the density higher, or in other words the grain smaller, even smaller grains. You get less of these like repeated chunks and more of this timbre shift. So let me turn up chaos even more. Whereas if I turn density way down, notably larger chunks. So the other thing we can do with scan is, let's pick something. So there's a little bit of variation there, but it's not way out there. But let's now try and adjust the scan rate. I can set the scan rate to a positive rate, meaning that the playhead will move faster than the playback time. Make shorter grains. Notice that when the grains are longer, when we're playing fast, we actually skip a lot of the audio. Whereas when the grains are short, we still capture more of that audio, but we lose a bit of the texture that came with it. So that's a kind of trade-off parameter there. And obviously chaos allows you to adjust that to a greater degree, to how much of that textural variation. The scan rate goes all the way down to 0, meaning it can stay at the very beginning. But let's try it at, say, 0.1. So you can hear as the grain gets short, the repetitions get this metallic quality to them. And when the chaos gets high, we get a lot of jumping about in the sample. Let's try paraphonic. So pretty interesting. The next two algorithms I'll try and go through a little more quickly. How does cloud differ from scan? Well, cloud, in scan, you specify the rate, so it always has the playhead starting at the beginning and moving through. In cloud, the playhead is placed by the start parameter. Remember, these parameters are all modulatable. So the start parameter, I can manually adjust it, and the other parameters are density and chaos, just like in scan. So instead of us having the playhead moving through the sound, we can adjust where it is placed. So let's just pick a couple of parameters here. Let's make the density a bit higher. Lower the chaos, and now let's just scan the start point. So I can find a piece of the sample has interesting timbral quality, and consider that I could, for example, apply an LFO to that. Or I could have differing start points for each note using the randomization or the linear parameter. So we have a different way of selecting where the grains come from and a different expressive control set around those. Let's go to the next algorithm. The next algorithm is hit grains. So the parameters are start, just like in the cloud grains, their density, but the final one is shape. So consider that the previous two algorithms used chaos. Chaos was selecting where the grain is with respect to the playhead. And in the previous algorithm, we were adjusting where the playhead is with that start parameter. So we have that same start parameter, we have the same density parameter picking the grain size, but in this case, the grain will always be chosen from the playhead. There is no chaos. So what does the final parameter mean here, this shape parameter? Well, remember I mentioned the grains get cut at 0 crossings. This isn't necessarily sufficient to get rid of any clickiness in the sound. So often an envelope is applied to the grain as it plays back, and the shape parameter allows us to adjust the shape of that envelope. So let's just listen to it. So to me, it sounds like it's going from a sort of exponential to logarithmic. So we have very different sort of choppy sounds at the start and end of the sample. And as before, we can move the start point as we wish. So when we make this really short, almost has a wavetable sound to it. So when the density is very high, the grains are very short. So it's almost like sweeping a wavetable. So as with a wavetable, you might want to animate that parameter using an envelope. So now let's design a sound here. First, let's pick a sample. So let's jump back to the sample algorithm. And let's pick a different sample. What sounds interesting by the name? Maybe a synth up. I guess that's melodic. Let's try for something that's... Okay, this is pretty interesting. Now let's pick one of the algorithms. Let's try the cloud algorithm. So first let's get the density and chaos parameters set in a way that gives us something that's timbrally interesting. Okay, I'm thinking a pad here, so let's shape the amplitude envelope first. So one of the parameters that I've been mentioning is this new capacity to use the keyboard as a random modulation source. So I'm going to change the keyboard row modes to random. Now I'm going to use that to adjust the start point in the sample. So I'll pick somewhere in the middle of that, and then I'll have this randomness So I think we already have a quite interesting texture there. I think what we need to add though is probably some filter motion. So first let's tweak the cutoff. And maybe let's have the pressure of the keyboard. Let's see. So the pressure mode can be aftertouch. So then the aftertouch, we can have adjust the chaos parameter. So let's turn chaos down a little bit. And now let's have pressure adjust, which one? Chaos is the shape parameter, which is mapped by default to assignable 3. I'd also like it to decrease, actually, so I've had it increase the density and also increase the chaos. Maybe it can increase that more. So now let's add this envelope to give us some motion to the filter. Let's have it swell, maybe 3 seconds up, 4 seconds down, 50% sustain, and then that's the cycling envelope. And I will just use that to adjust the filter cutoff. So let's go for that. Usually we don't want to modulate the filter cutoff too much because there is only one filter, so the advantage of the paraphony and the special oscillator section applies mostly when we don't have filter motion. We have a couple of other parameters here. Let's see what we got. We can have the velocity of the initial impact adjust the amplitude of the note. So this gives us a little more expression. So I think that's about as far as I'd like to go today. Hopefully this has illustrated that firstly there are some interesting presets available, but secondly that the sample playback and all the granular engines really do open a whole range of parameters that you can use to generate completely different sounds. Now I certainly wish there was some capacity to do stereo placement here. I wish there was some effects built in, and I very much hope that these oscillator algorithms make their way into the Mini-Freak. In any case, this is my first impression of the 5.0 firmware. I think it's opened a lot of opportunities for me, and I'll definitely be experimenting with this a lot more. But in any case, thank you very much for joining me here today, and goodbye.